Morgan Reynolds adjusted her safety helmet and looked at the gigantic hull of the USS Invincible, looming above her like a steel skyscraper lying on the water. At 29, she was the youngest and only female naval engineer assigned to the U.S. Navy's aircraft carrier maintenance team at Naval Base Norfolk, Virginia. With her brown hair always tied back in a practical ponytail and determined green eyes, Morgan had grown accustomed to being the only woman in male-dominated environment. It was an autumn morning, and the sky was covered with heavy clouds, creating a gray atmosphere that reflected on the surface of the harbor waters. The USS Invincible, one of the largest and most powerful aircraft carriers in the American fleet, was anchored for routine maintenance that was expected to last 3 weeks. As a propulsion systems engineer, Morgan had been sent to lead one of the teams responsible for overhauling the main engines. While organizing his tools and preparing to board, Morgan noticed a group of Marines gathered on the dock. They had just returned from an exercise and seemed to be in high spirits, laughing and sharing stories. Their presence was not uncommon. Marines frequently conducted training exercises aboard aircraft carriers. An integration between the different armed forces was part of daily life on naval bases. Morgan climbed the access ramp, carrying her heavy toolbox. She was used to the weight, but still felt the strain after a sleepless night. The preliminary inspection report indicated a serious problem with the ship's propellers, something that would require all her attention and expertise. "Hey, look who's here," a male voice shouted behind her, making her stop. Turning around, Morgan saw a group of 5 Marines approaching. He immediately recognized Sergeant Hicks, a burly man with whom he'd had some disagreements in the past. Hicks was known for his old-fashioned behavior and his traditional views on gender roles in the armed forces. "Good morning, Sergeant," Morgan replied, maintaining the professional tone he always used in situations like this. "So, you're the one who's going to fix our ship?" Hicks asked with a mocking smile. "I can't wait to see it." The other Marines laughed, exchanging knowing glances. "I'm here to work on the propulsion systems," Morgan explained, trying to downplay the provocative tone. "And yes, I'm qualified for it." "Qualified?" Hicks gave a forced laugh. "Look, no offense, but this is a 100,000-ton aircraft carrier. It's not a small boat you can just push if something goes wrong." Again, laughter. Morgan felt her face flush, but she maintained her composure. It wasn't the first time her competence had been questioned because of her gender, and it certainly wouldn't be the last. "Actually, Sergeant, I did my postgraduate studies in naval engineering in Annapolis, specializing in nuclear propulsion systems. So yes, I know exactly what I'm doing. Theory and practice are different things, my dear," Hicks replied, crossing his arms. "I bet you $100 you couldn't move that aircraft carrier an inch if the engines failed." The Marines laughed even louder. Morgan took a deep breath, trying to control the anger that was beginning to boil inside her. So normally she would ignore comments like that and go on her way, but something that day made her stop. "I accept the bet," she said, surprising herself and the Marines. $100? That seems like too little for such a big challenge. How about 1,000? The smile on Hicks' face faltered for a moment, but soon returned even wider. $1,000? Are you sure? That's almost half your monthly salary, isn't it? "Actually, no," Morgan replied curtly. "But you seem to be hesitating, Sergeant. You're not so confident now?" The other Marines let out a collective "ooh," looking at Hicks, who now seemed slightly uncomfortable. He hadn't expected her to accept the challenge, much less raise the stakes. "All right," he said finally, extending his hand. $1,000. If you can move this aircraft carrier without using the main engines, I'll pay you. If you can't, you pay. Fair enough?" Morgan squeezed his hand, feeling the adrenaline rush through his veins. "That's right. You have 1 week to gather the money, Sergeant." As she walked away, she heard the Marines laughing and mocking. "She's crazy," said one. "Not even 100 men could move that monster without the engines," commented another. Morgan smiled to herself. She had a plan, something she had studied during her final year in Annapolis, but which had never been tested in real-world conditions. It would be her opportunity to prove not only her competence, but also to show that innovation and knowledge were worth more than brute force. What the Marines didn't know was that Morgan wasn't just a talented engineer. She was a pioneer, someone who had always pushed the boundaries and never backed down from challenge. And now she faced one of the greatest challenges of her career, moving a 100,000-ton steel colossus without using its main engines. The gamble was on, and Morgan Reynolds had no intention of losing. The preparation in the following days, Morgan devoted every free minute to her secret project. After completing her official duties working on the propulsion systems of the USS Invincible, she immersed herself in calculations, reviewed hydrodynamic theories, and drew technical diagrams in her small makeshift office aboard the ship. News of the bet spread quickly around the base. In less than 48 hours, virtually every sailor, technician, and officer knew that engineer Morgan Reynolds had wagered $1,000 that she could move the aircraft carrier without using its main engines. Reactions ranged from outright skepticism to intrigued curiosity. Some placed their own side bets, most betting against her. "Do you really think you can do this?" asked Terrence Wilson, a fellow, an engineer who had become one of Morgan's few friends at the base. They were sitting in the cafeteria during a short lunch break. Morgan pushed his plate of chicken pasta aside and opened his tablet, showing Terrence a series of equations and diagrams. "Look, I'm not saying I'm going to tow him away by myself with a rope," she explained. "I'm talking about using basic physical principles to our advantage. Are you familiar with the concept of differential pressure movement?" Terrence examined the calculations, frowning. "Interesting theory, but have you ever seen it applied to something the size of an air?" "No," Morgan admitted, "but the principles are sound. In theory, it works with any vessel, regardless of size. It's just a matter of scale and the correct application of forces." "And how do you intend to implement this? You know you don't have authorization to structurally modify the ship, right?" Morgan smiled, his eyes gleaming with the enthusiasm of someone who knows he is about to attempt something revolutionary. "I don't need to structurally modify the ship. Everything I need is already on board. It's just a matter of redirecting the resources we already have." The following morning, Morgan requested a meeting with Commander Rachel Adams, the officer responsible for overseeing maintenance operations on the USS Invincible. The commander, a 45-year-old woman with over 2 decades of experience in the Navy, was known for her pragmatic approach and her willingness to consider innovative ideas, provided they were well-founded. "Let me understand correctly," Commander Adams said after Morgan explained his proposal. "You want to use the aircraft carrier's auxiliary systems to create a pressure differential in the hull, essentially allowing the ship to move without its main thrusters?" "Exactly, Commander. It's a concept I studied during my postgraduate studies. It's never been tested on a large scale, but all theoretical models indicate that it's feasible." Commander Adams leaned back in her chair, carefully studying the young engineer in front of her. "And does this have anything to do with the bet you made with Sergeant Hicks?" Morgan felt her face flush slightly. Of course the commander would know about the bet. "Yes, ma'am. I admit it was impulsive of me to accept the bet, but now you're determined to win," Adams finished with a slight smile. "I understand. Believe me, I know what it's like to be underestimated." She picked up the documents Morgan had brought and flipped through them quickly. "Your calculations seem solid. What exactly do you—" "I need access to the ballast pumping systems, controlled flooding, and auxiliary thrusters. And I need a team of 6 people to help me with the implementation." Commander Adams reflected for a moment. "You realize that if something goes wrong, it could seriously affect your career, right? And potentially mine as well, for authorizing this." "Yes, ma'am. But there is no structural risk to the ship? In the worst-case scenario, we simply won't be able to generate enough movement. We are not manipulating any critical systems. And in the best-case scenario?" Morgan smiled, feeling confidence growing within her. "In the best-case scenario, we demonstrated an alternative propulsion technique that could be useful in emergency situations when the main systems are compromised. And, of course, we earned $1,000 from a sergeant who needs to learn to respect competence regardless of gender." Commander Adams laughed, shaking her head. "You have spirit, Reynolds. I admire that." She signed the authorization form that was on her desk. "You are permitted to proceed, but with constant supervision and daily progress reports. And if I feel there is any significant risk to the ship, I will terminate the operation immediately." Understood? Perfectly, Commander. Thank you. When Morgan left the commander's office, she felt a mixture of relief and anxiety. The first obstacle was overcome. She had official authorization to implement her plan. Now came the hardest part, turning theories and calculations into reality. Over the next 72 hours, Morgan worked tirelessly. She recruited a small team consisting of 3 hydraulic systems technicians, 2 electronic specialists, and a meteorologist from the base. Each of them, initially skeptical, gradually became enthusiastic about the project as Morgan explained the details of her approach. The basic idea is simple, Morgan explained during the team's first meeting. We're going to create a hydrodynamic pressure differential around the hull. Using ballast pumps in conjunction with controlled flooding systems, we can essentially pull the ship forward, like a giant version of jet propulsion. But using the water around the hull instead of engines, commented Lisa Chun, one of the electronic specialists. Exactly, confirmed Morgan, pleased that her team was understanding the concept. And with the support of the auxiliary bow thrusters, we can direct the initial movement. While Morgan's team worked discreetly on the preparations, the excitement surrounding the bet continued to grow. Sergeant Hicks and his fellow Marines would occasionally show up to check on the progress, always with sarcastic comments and mocking laughter. Morgan simply smiled and continued his work, knowing that the day of truth was approaching. On the eve of the big test, Morgan made a final check on all the systems. The weather forecast for the following day was ideal. Calm seas, light winds, and a favorable tide. Everything was aligned for what she hoped would be a historic moment not only for her career, but potentially for naval engineering as a whole. That night, lying in her bunk, Morgan mentally reviewed every detail of the plan. She had considered all the variables, all the possible problems, all the contingency. Theoretically, it should work, but theory and practice didn't always go hand in hand, as Sergeant Hicks himself had pointed out. Before going to sleep, Morgan looked at the photo on her bedside table, a picture of herself at age 12. Next to her father, a former naval engineer who had encouraged her interest in ships and the sea. "You can do anything you set your mind to, Morgan," he always said. "Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." Tomorrow would be the day to prove he was right. Challenge Day dawn brought a clear sky and an exceptionally calm sea, exactly as Morgan had hoped. By 5:30 a.m., she was already aboard the USS Invincible, checking every detail one last time. Her team arrived soon after, all visibly anxious but determined to make history. "All systems are checked and ready," reported Lisa Chun, consulting her tablet. "The ballast pumps are operational and the reservoirs are at the ideal level." "Excellent," Morgan replied. "And the auxiliary thrusters?" "Calibrated exactly as you specified," said Miguel Sanchez, the hydraulics specialist. "We managed to achieve the perfect angle for the initial thrust." Morgan nodded, feeling a mixture of nervousness and excitement. She checked her watch. 6:45 a.m. The test was scheduled to begin at 8 a.m., and a small group could already be seen forming on the dock to watch what many considered a doomed attempt. As the sun rose on the horizon, more and more people began to gather. Sailors, officers, civilian technicians, and of course, a particularly noisy group of Marines led by Sergeant Hicks. Morgan noticed that some carried cameras and even binoculars, eager not to miss any detail of the spectacle to come. At 7:30 a.m., Commander Adams arrived, accompanied by 2 senior officers whom Morgan did not know. She seemed calm, but Morgan could see the tension in her eyes. "Are we ready, Reynolds?" the commander asked. "Yes, ma'am. All systems have been checked and the team is in position. We're just waiting for your order to begin." The commander looked at the crowded dock, and then at the officers beside her. "It seems you've attracted quite a bit of attention. Rear Admiral Peterson and Captain Rodriguez were interested in your ... experience." Morgan swallowed hard. He hadn't expected such high-ranking officials to be present. This significantly increased the pressure, but also the potential reward if everything went according to plan. "It's an honor to have you here, gentlemen," she said, greeting the officers. "I hope that what you will see today will be of interest for future applications in the..." Rear Admiral Peterson, a stern-looking man with gray hair, nodded briefly. "Commander Adams told us about her theory. I confess I'm skeptical, but I always appreciate innovation. Good luck. At 7:55 a.m., Morgan's team took up their position. The plan was simple in theory, but complex in execution. They would use the ballast pumps in conjunction with the controlled flooding system to create a partial vacuum in the bow, while simultaneously creating a high-pressure area in the stern. This pressure differential, combined with the thrust of the auxiliary thrusters, should generate enough movement to noticeably move the aircraft carrier. Sergeant Hicks and his group positioned themselves strategically on the dock, right in Morgan's line of sight. They laughed and made provocative gestures, clearly anticipating imminent failure. At precisely 8 a.m., Commander Adams gave the authorization. "You can start the sequence, Reynolds. Good luck." Morgan took a deep breath and nodded to his team. "Initiate the Alpha sequence. Ballast pumps at 30% capacity." The technicians immediately began to operate the controls. A faint hum filled the air as the powerful pumps went into action. "Pumps are stable at 30%, boss," reported one of the technicians. "Great. Increase it to 50% and begin controlled flooding of the front compartment." As the water began to be redistributed throughout the ship's immense hull, Morgan closely monitored the control panels. Everything was proceeding exactly as planned. "Pressure differential reaching expected levels," Lisa reported. "We are approaching the critical point." On the dock, the noise of the crowd began to subside. Even from a distance, it was possible to notice a slight change in the waters around the aircraft carrier, as if something invisible were pulling the surface toward the hull. "Initiate the auxiliary thrusters at 25%, Morgan ordered, keeping his voice steady despite his racing heart. An almost imperceptible tremor ran across the deck beneath his feet. It was the first sign that something was happening. "Increase the pumps to 75% and maintain a constant flood." The following minutes were filled with absolute tension. The crowd on the dock had fallen completely silent, all eyes fixed on the gigantic ship. Even the group of Marines had stopped their taunts, watching intently. Suddenly, one of the gauges on the dashboard started moving. "Morgan!" exclaimed Lisa, pointing to the display. "We're registering movement. 0.1 knots and increasing." A wave of excitement swept through the team, but Morgan remained focused. "Maintain stability. Increase auxiliary thrust to 40%. Slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, the USS Invincible began to move. It wasn't a powerful lunge, but a smooth, controlled glide through the calm harbor waters. The mooring lines, deliberately loose for the test, stretched slightly before yielding to the ship's movement. On the dock, the reaction was immediate. A murmur of astonishment swept through the crowd, followed by shouts of enthusiasm and applause. Morgan allowed himself a brief smile before returning his attention to the controls. "We're at 0.3 knots and stable," Miguel reported. "The pressure differential is keeping the momentum constant. Increase to 0.5 knots and hold for 30 seconds. Morgan ordered. "Then begin the deceleration sequence." The aircraft carrier continued its smooth movement, leaving behind a minimal but unmistakable wake. To any observer, it was clear that the steel colossus was moving without the use of its main thrusters. On the dock, Sergeant Hicks watched silently, the expression of shock on his face captured by several cameras around him. Beside him, the other Marines seemed equally stunned. After exactly 30 seconds at peak speed, Morgan gave the order to begin deceleration. Reduce auxiliary thrusters to 10% and reverse controlled flooding. Ballast pumps to 40% in recirculation mode. Gradually, the aircraft carrier slowed down until it came to a complete stop. Having traveled a distance of approximately 30 meters, that was more than enough to prove the point. A momentary silence followed by an explosion of applause and celebratory shouts filled the dock. Morgan finally allowed himself to relax, a genuine smile spreading across his face as his team celebrated around him. Commander Adams approached, accompanied by senior officers. To Morgan's surprise, there was a smile on Rear Admiral Peterson's face. "Impressive, Engineer Reynolds," he said, extending his hand. "Absolutely impressive. You not only won a bet today, but you demonstrated a technique that could be invaluable in emergency situations." "Thank you, sir," Morgan replied, shaking the Admiral's hand firmly. "I would like you to prepare a detailed report on this technique," he continued. I believe other vessels in the fleet could benefit from this knowledge. It will be an honor, sir. The celebration continued while the team began the procedures to normalize the systems. Morgan finally had a moment to look toward the dock where Sergeant Hicks stood, visibly dumbfounded. Later that day, while Morgan and his team were finalizing the test record, there was a knock on the door of the makeshift office. "Come in," Morgan called, without lifting his eyes from the documents he was reviewing. The door opened and Sergeant Hicks entered, looking considerably less confident than in previous days. "Engineer Reynolds," he greeted formally. Morgan looked up, surprised to see him there. "Sergeant Hicks, what can I do for you?" He cleared his throat, visibly uncomfortable. "I've come to pay my debt," he said, holding out an envelope. $1,000 as we agreed. Morgan looked at the envelope, then at the sergeant, and finally at his team, who were watching the scene with interest. "Thank you, Sergeant," she said, accepting the envelope. Then, to everyone's surprise, including her own, she continued, "But I'm not going to keep the money. I'm going to donate it to the scholarship program for young women interested in careers in the Navy. I think it's a better use for it, don't you think?" Hicks stared at her for a long moment before nodding slowly. "Yes, I think so." He hesitated before adding, "What you did today was ... impressive. I didn't think it was possible." "Many things are possible, Sergeant. Sometimes all we need is someone doubting us prove otherwise." He nodded. Again, a slight smile appearing on his face. "Well, consider me correct." He extended his hand. "No hard feeling." Morgan accepted the hand. "No hard feeling. And next time, maybe think twice before doubting someone's abilities based solely on appearances." When Hicks left, Lisa approached Morgan. "That was very noble of you, refusing the money." Morgan smiled. "It wasn't about the money. It never was. It was about proving a point." She looked out the window at the enormous aircraft docked in the harbor, "and I think we did that very well." Repercussions in the following weeks. Morgan Reynolds' feat became legendary at the Norfolk Naval Base. What had begun as a simple bet turned into a case study for Naval Academy cadets and a topic of discussion among naval engineers across the country. The term Reynolds effect, as some began to call the technique she had used, was being mentioned at technical conferences and in specialized publications. 2 weeks after the successful tests, Morgan was summoned to a meeting at Navy headquarters in Washington, D.C. To her surprise, the room was filled not only with Navy officers, but also with representatives from the Coast Guard, the Army Corps of Engineers, and even some civilian agencies. Engineer Reynolds began Vice Admiral Harrison, head of the Navy's Research and Development Department. "Your report on the testing on the USS Invincible has caused quite a stir around here." Morgan, dressed in her formal Navy uniform, nodded respectfully. "I didn't mean to cause a stir, sir. I only wanted to demonstrate a practical application of a theory I had studied, and she demonstrated it brilliantly," commented a woman whom Morgan recognized as Dr. Eliza Montgomery, a renowned hydrodynamics expert from MIT. "Her method of creating a pressure differential to generate thrust is fascinating, especially considering she used only systems already in place on the ship." The meeting continued for over 3 hours, with Morgan explaining in detail the principles behind her technique, answering questions, and discussing possible future applications. It became clear to her that what had begun as a way to win a bet had the potential to evolve into something much bigger. "We are considering implementing your technique as a standard emergency procedure across the fleet," Vice Admiral Harrison explained at the end of the meeting. "In situations where the main engines are compromised, your approach could literally be the difference between life and death for our crew." "It would be an honor, sir," Morgan replied, still trying to process the impact his idea was having. "Furthermore," he continued, "I would like to offer you a position in our R&D department. I believe your innovative perspective and unconventional thinking would be extremely valuable to our current and future projects." Morgan was momentarily speechless. A position in the R&D department was something many engineers only dreamed of, usually after decades of service. "I'm immensely grateful for the offer, sir. It would be an honor to be part of the team." Back in Norfolk, Morgan received a warm welcome from his staff and colleagues. News of his upcoming transfer to Washington had already spread, and many wanted to express their congratulations. Commander Adams called her in for a private conversation in her office. "I'm proud of you, Reynolds," she said with a genuine smile. "Not everyone would have the courage to face skepticism the way you did." "Thank you, Commander. Without your support, none of this would have been possible." Adams shook his head. "You would have found a way. People like you always do." She paused, looking out the window at the harbor where the USS Invincible was anchored. "You know, when I was a young officer, I was the only woman in my squadron for almost 3 years. I heard things, faced challenges my male colleagues never had to face. But each barrier I broke made the path a little easier for the next woman." She turned to Morgan. "What you did wasn't just about moving a ship or winning a bet. It was about showing that innovation and excellence have no gender. And because of that, many young women who come after you will have a slightly more open path." Morgan felt a surge of emotion, understanding the true impact of his action. On her last day in Norfolk, before leaving for Washington, Morgan was surprised by a small, informal ceremony organized by her team. Lisa, Miguel, and the others had prepared a small cake and a card signed by everyone. "To the woman who moved an aircraft carrier, and to our understanding of what is possible," Lisa read aloud, provoking laughter and applause. To Morgan's surprise, Sergeant Hicks was also present, accompanied by some of the Marines who had been with him on the day of the bet. "We came to say goodbye," he said, sounding genuinely cordial, "and to wish you good luck in Washington. They're lucky to have you." "Thank you, Sergeant. I appreciate that. And just so you know," he added, lowering his voice, "that scholarship program you donated money to, the boys and I contributed as well. It seemed ... appropriate." Morgan smiled, realizing that perhaps the greatest victory had not been moving the aircraft, but changing perspectives. The following morning, as she left Norfolk, Morgan looked one last time at the immense aircraft carrier anchored in the harbor. The USS Invincible stood imposing and majestic, seemingly motionless. But she knew what few knew, that even the most still things can be set in motion with the right approach. On the train to Washington, Morgan opened her laptop and began working on a new project. Her thoughts were already focused on the future, on the innovations it could bring, on the barriers that still needed to be broken, because she had learned a fundamental truth. In the world of engineering, as in life, the limits of what is possible are often defined ... They only appreciate our willingness to challenge the status quo and question what everyone says is impossible. And Morgan Reynolds was only beginning to challenge those limits.